So, do you ever wonder why Marxism is so bad? I mean, maybe we can figure out a way to make it work. It does look pretty good on paper, where we all cooperate together, we meet each other's needs, even sounds biblical in some ways, but why is it that bad, and can we baptize it? This is Matthew Garnett. Welcome to In Layman's Terms.
There was a wave for snipping ears, the night-time snipping of individual ears of grain in the field, a totally new type of agricultural activity, a new type of harvesting. The wave of those caught doing this was not small. It included many tens of thousands of peasants, many of them not even adults, but boys, girls, and small children whose elders had sent them out at night to snip because they had no hope of receiving anything from the collective farm for their daytime labor. For this bitter and not very productive occupation, an extreme of poverty to which the peasants had not been driven even in serfdom, the courts handed out a full measure, 10 years, for what ranked as an especially dangerous theft of socialist property under the notorious law of August 7, 1932, which, in prisoners' lingo, was known simply as the Law of 7/8.
We're going to look this week at, why can't we just use Marxism? Sounds good. Can't we fix it? Can't we put it together? Maybe make it work. Haven't talked about this issue in a while. I wanted to circle back to it because there's been a lecture put out by Dr. Vodi Bakum that talks about this issue that I think will help us get our minds around what's the big deal. See, I think a lot of people, when I talk about Marxism, I mean, this is something I've been talking about for a long time and I've understood for a long time. And when I talk about it, I kind of get lumped into that category with everybody else who's just kind of parroting that idea. And we don't really know what we're talking about. So we're going to get into what really Marxism is about today. But before we do, I want to welcome to everybody listening on KNNA The Cross. Those of you listening on the live stream right now, that makes no sense to you whatsoever, but this recording is actually going to go out live on the airwaves eventually. So we've got to welcome everyone on KNNA The Cross. Also, thank you to Steve Kozar and the messedupchurch.com for having us there. There's tons of great resources there, guys. You can listen to my podcast for free there if you're a cheapskate, but if you really want to be a good biblical Christian, I'm saying that tongue-in-cheek, you should go to my website, laymanstermsradio.org, and pay per podcast. We've got that set up now. You can donate $5, $10, or $15. You should donate, you cheapskates, $5 a podcast. If the people who downloaded my podcast every week paid $5 per podcast, for 1 month straight, we would have this done. We would have the money raised to dig this well. It's that simple. You can also donate a one-time gift of $50. Right? These children are carrying water from local streams and rivers, and the water isn't always in that great a shape. And this wears them out. I mean, how much do you feel like learning algebra when you're tired? You don't. So let's get this well dug. We can do it, people. We just got to get it together on this. Got to get it together. All right. Go to laymanstermsradio.org and donate in some way, shape, manner, or form. And thank you to everybody who has us on their websites or radio stations. We've got a lot of content to cover in this. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground. I'm going to let our experts speak here on this. I'm trying to work this out in my mind. This is a little bit like the transgender, the sexual revolution issue. I think we talk about the fact that those things are sins, but a lot of times we don't talk about the reasons why those things are sins and how they're harmful to the people engaged in them and how they're harmful to those around them. That's what we're going to do in this episode with Marxism, so hopefully it will be helpful to you. Let's kick it off.
One of the reasons it's not really a debate is because there's a lot of name calling, right? People address the issue of social justice. Some topic comes up. One person says it's a social justice issue. The other person calls them a cultural Marxist, and then they turn around and call the person a racist. And that's about all the debate that you get. It's name calling, and things get short circuited because of the name calling. And often neither side is being completely honest. And we know it. Often the person who's looking at their brother and saying, you're just a cultural Marxist, doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the person is, even though they may believe that they're espousing some of the ideas that come from cultural Marxism. And generally the person who turns back and says, you're just a racist, knows better. But both sides recognize that that's a way to shut the other down. Because right now, these are not issues that are being debated. These are not issues that are being discussed. And in fact, in many instances, the mere act of debating and discussing these issues is considered to make you a cultural Marxist or a racist. On the one hand, if the one person says that this was an injustice and you turn around and want to debate and whether or not that was an injustice, and look at you, how dare you? I just told you that this was an injustice. How insensitive can you be to not acknowledge this injustice? And on the other hand, the other person who genuinely doesn't believe that an injustice has occurred is trying to point out why an injustice hasn't necessarily occurred here and have a finger pointed at them and are called a racist. And they say, wait a minute, really? How long have we known each other? You know that's not who I am. And so we end up just sort of not addressing the issues.
So the silence tactic, that goes on both sides. But my dear conservative Christian friends, and just conservative friends whatsoever, when you throw out that term Marxism as a tactic to shut down the debate, you are employing a postmodern neo-Marxist, cultural Marxist, critical theory tactic. Because here's the deal. In critical theory, in postmodern philosophy, the debate is not about, they're not interested in a debate as we traditionally have understood it. Debate, as I'll get to in a second, is a means by which a certain group is able to hold on to their privilege and power. To postmoderns who understand what they're talking about, and to some people who don't understand what they're talking about, truth is not a thing. The thing is what subverts. So take the sexual revolution. There's this whole debate going on right now about how, and we played a little bit of this, a few weeks ago to maybe even set this up. This whole idea of how the transgender movement is really harming the feminist movement. So there's this whole clash of worldviews in that. But the genuine postmodern critical theorist sees that as that's perfect, because what are we doing? We are subverting all the way from head to toe. Yeah, does our movement make sense? No, doesn't matter. Is it subverting? You better believe it is. It's subverting in every sense of the term. That's what they're looking for, and that's why you a lot of times cannot get an honest debate from people. Now, those of us who are recognizing this, who could talk about cultural Marxism like Dr. Bauckham, we can come along, and sometimes we kind of get caught up in that. And we want to pitch out terms like that. We want to silence the other person and shame them and say, oh, you're just a Marxist. And so we don't really want to hear what you have to say on this issue. That's not the answer either. And that's what Dr. Bauckham is very well pointing out. Shutting down traditional debate is exactly what Derrida was after when he talked about foul logocentrism. If you're familiar with this term, the phallus, the male genitalia, logo, which is the spoken word, centrism. So the male spoken word has been focused on. And we want to do away with that. Debate itself, according to Derrida, is foul logocentrism. So for you to bring up debate or for you to question a point, we're going to talk about this toward the end of the podcast when we address the book White Fragility. But for you to debate this is foul logocentrism. And that's, I think, a symptom of, I think you see that's on college campuses. I think they are mimicking people who know how to shut down debate because they are using the principle of phallogocentrism to shut down debate, and they're mimicking that. They don't know what phallogocentrism is at all, but they are mimicking people that are doing that. And we do the same thing on our side. We see people talking about cultural Marxism, like, yeah, that's Marxism, that's socialism, that's bad. We don't, yeah. Today, hopefully, I'm going to educate you a little bit about why Marxism is bad and how to recognize it. Right. So, but that's the real idea. The silence tactic really boils down to, look, if you've got a genuine postmodern on your hands, or someone who is mimicking postmodern behavior, they're not interested in debate. They don't care about truth. What they care about is what subverts. And when you understand that, then a whole world starts to open up to you, because you go, oh, yeah, that makes complete sense. Because the sexual revolution makes no logical, reasonable sense whatsoever. And everybody's freaking out. Why are they doing this? It doesn't make any sense. They're doing this, that, and the other thing. They're subverting. Ask yourself, is what's going on subverting debate? Yeah, it is. Is it silencing people? Yeah, it is. Does it make any sense? No, it doesn't. Does making no sense subvert? Yes, it does. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, the best way, if you want a practical measure by which to kind of break through what we would term as nonsense, to them it makes complete sense, because again, if it subverts, it goes. Like if it bleeds, it leads. If it subverts, that's what we're doing. What I try to do is shift the debate back to the very, very basic and foundational understanding of their worldview. I start talking about stuff like Jacques Derrida. I start bringing stuff like this out, like phallogocentrism. Start talking about that. Hey, did you realize? And a lot of times what I've found is the people that are mimicking the genuine postmodern neo-Marxists, they're just mimicking. If you start to bring this stuff up with them, they'll go, oh, I didn't realize that's where that came from. And then you can start a discussion with it. It's pretty interesting. So somebody comes out and says something, outlandish about race or something like that. You just bring up Jacques Derrida. Start talking about him. Start talking about phallogocentrism. Look up that word. Familiarize yourself with it. I would not suggest you try to read Derrida. I've done my attempting at that. It's generally speaking a waste of time because, don't bother yourself with reading Derrida. Go study some people who are experts on him and what he was after. Okay, and that will be a better way forward for you than trying to read him and try to understand, because there is an agenda here. No matter what the postmoderns say, they have a meta narrative. They have an agenda. Because they wouldn't all be together on these certain political topics and religious topics and spiritual topics if they didn't have a cohesive agenda, which was to subvert what's there. We've talked about deconstructionism and what that means, inverting the binary, all that stuff. You can go listen to my podcast on that, but that's the idea here. And so Dr. Bauckham is spot on to talk about how slowing down debate is a postmodern tactic. And if we're engaging in that, you're wrong. You're wrong. Don't engage in that. Okay, let's move on.
Nearly a decade and a half now, I've been addressing this issue. So with that in mind, let's look at it. A couple of things. First, cultural Marxism and classical Marxism are two different things. And this is one of the things that makes the discussion difficult. Classical Marxism, Karl Marx was an economist, right? I mean, classical Marxism is an economic system. We know about the bourgeois and the proletariat. We know from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. We know about the uprising of the masses. To overthrow capitalism. We know that Marx was a communist who wanted to see capitalism overthrown. He saw capitalism as oppressing the masses. He also saw religion as the opiate of the masses that allowed them to be oppressed by capitalism. So he was rabidly atheistic. And this is one of the things that makes it difficult to talk to people about cultural Marxism, right? Because classical Marxism is something that for most Christians, for most evangelicals, for real Christians, for real evangelicals who are not way out there on the fringe somewhere, just wouldn't identify with Marxism. And if we don't understand the difference between classical Marxism, this economic system, and cultural Marxism, which is very different than this in its approach, then if you just hear the word, it's like, well, how can you say that? How can you suggest that? Three main ideas. Let me give you this just to understand Marx, a summary of his salient points. Number one, he believed that history had really three stages or epochs. Number one, the ancient stage. Secondly, the feudal stage. And thirdly, the capitalist stage. He believed that he was witnessing the rise and would see eventually the fall of the capitalist stage. The second idea was the idea of class consciousness, that each one of these societal epochs contained internal contradictions. And these internal contradictions is what would lead to struggle and would eventually lead to the next phase, which led to the third idea, his idea of historical determinism, that ultimately capitalism would fall. Capitalism had to fall. Why? Because the way he viewed history was a view of struggle, was a series of struggles, a series of conflicts. He was a disciple of Hegel. So this was sort of his dialectic, if you will. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? So capitalism had to fall. Workers of the world would unite and there would be a revolution. And there was, right? But not everywhere. And so toward the end of his life, and then during the life of his followers, they tried to explain and understand why it is that capitalism didn't fall. I mean, if capitalism is exploitation of the masses, and if history is all about these conflicts, and if this conflict is going to come, and if the next thing that is going to come is a post-capitalist society, then why haven't we seen this? Enter the cultural Marxists with a couple of goals. Number one, to explain why the revolution didn't occur as Marx thought it would. Marx died in 1888, by the way. So now we get into the late 1800s, the early 1900s. We get into World War I. And there are a couple of players that you need to know if you're going to understand cultural Marxism. One is a guy by the name of Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci was an Italian Marxist. Another one is not an individual, but a group of individuals, known as the Frankfurt School. Two ideas. One, Gramsci's idea of cultural hegemony. Listen to the way one sociologist puts it. Cultural hegemony refers to domination or rule maintained through ideological or cultural means. It is usually achieved through social institutions which allow those in power to strongly influence the values, norms, ideas, expectations, worldview, and behavior of the rest of society. Cultural hegemony. That's the power. By the way, this idea of cultural hegemony explains something. Have you ever wondered why women who make up more than 50% of the population are considered a minority? You ever wondered why? Because women are not seen as part of the cultural hegemony. The cultural hegemony is patriarchal. The cultural hegemony, for example, in our society is white, male, heterosexual, cisgendered, able-bodied, native-born Americans. You know who you are. And everybody who's not that is a minority. And everybody who's not that is a victim of the cultural hegemony established by those individuals. Which means that everybody who's not that is at war with that. And everybody who is that is privileged. And the more of those boxes you tick off, the more privileged you are. Shame. Listen to this. Gramsci developed the concept of cultural hegemony in an effort to explain why the worker-led revolution that Marx predicted in the previous century had not come to pass. Central to Marx's theory of capitalism was the belief that the destruction of this economic system was built into the system itself, since capitalism is premised on the exploitation of the working class by the ruling class. Why didn't it happen? Well, because we're not dealing with economics. We're dealing with culture. Marx missed this part. Or so Gramsci would argue. He missed this part. So the revolution that comes doesn't need to be an armed revolution or a revolution of force. It needs to be a hegemonic revolution. In other words, we need to change the cultural hegemony. We need to overturn the cultural hegemony. And how do you overturn the cultural hegemony? A couple of things. For Gramsci, control the robes of society. What are the robes of society? You know, the people who wear robes. Judges. Professors. Pastors. Politicians. Leverage those positions in order to educate and mobilize the masses against the hegemonic power. Use the educational system, the political system, the judicial system in order to overturn the cultural hegemony. Does that sound at all familiar?
Later on in this lecture, and you should go listen to this lecture for sure. That's all I'm going to play of it for now. Later on in this lecture, Dr. Bauckham addresses what Matt Chandler had to say at the MLK 50 event, which I addressed in the Federalist article, 2 Federalist articles, in fact, which you should go read. If you just Google Matthew Garnett Federalist, you'll find those articles. Matt Chandler talked about how he would take a 7 black pastor over an 8 white pastor. That's kind of what needs to go on. And that's what Dr. Bauckham is talking about here. Now Dr. Bauckham puts that in the category of tokenism, which I think that's true. However, I would put it in this category of cultural hegemony. This is a shift in the cultural hegemony. So in other words, you have someone, forget about their skin color for a second. You have someone who is more proficient at a job than the next person. But because the next person's skin is a certain color, you're willing to forgo the person with the greater expertise to have this person with skin color. That is a subversion of cultural hegemony. We start to take the best people that are fit for for certain very important jobs, and we get rid of them because we're trying to change the hegemony. Because the theory is that the hegemony, the white male Christian who marries for life, who is heterosexual and has children, that has been destructive throughout human history. That is the great evil of human history. And believe me when I tell you, I realize that white, male, Christian, heterosexual, mate for life, have children type of folks have done great evils in this world, right along everyone else. They've suppressed people. They've oppressed people. They've come up with really bad ideas in which to hang on to their power. That has absolutely happened. However, I think as I'm going to demonstrate here, some of those people have brought us some of the greatest things we have in this world as well. But I think someone to talk to you about this better than I can is Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his book Gulag Archipelago, and he'll describe what it's like to take the best that you have in your culture in the name, take them out. I mean, physically take them out. Send them to a gulag or have them shot. Take them out in the name of an ideology. That's the danger we're talking about here when Dr. Bauckham talks about a cultural hegemony, talking about taking out the best people we have for certain roles in our culture in favor of an ideology. That's what's going on here. That's what Solzhenitsyn is going to describe to you in Gulag Archipelago in this extended quote that I want you to listen to. Made it long on purpose because I want you to hear all of it. Soak it in, because this is what we're talking about. This is what Dr. Bauckham is talking about.
And so the waves foamed and rolled, but over them all, in 1929 to 1930, billowed and gushed the multi-million wave of dispossessed kulaks. It was immeasurably large, and it would certainly not have been housed in even the highly developed network of Soviet interrogation prisons, which in any case were packed full by the gold wave. Instead, it bypassed the prisons, going directly to the transit prisons and camps, onto prisoner transports into the Gulag country. In sheer size, this non-recurring tidal wave, it was an ocean, swelled beyond the bounds of anything the penal system of even an immense state can permit itself. There was nothing to be compared with it in all Russian history. It was the forced resettlement of a whole people, an ethnic catastrophe. But yet so cleverly were the channels of the GPU Gulag organized that the cities would have noticed nothing had they not been stricken by a strange 3-year famine, a famine that came about without drought and without war. This wave was also distinct from all those which preceded it, because no one fussed about with taking the head of the family first and then working out what to do with the rest of the family. On the contrary, in this wave they burned out whole nests, whole families from the start. And they watched jealously to be sure that none of the children, 14, 10, even 6 years old, got away. To the last scrapings, all had to go down the same road, to the same common destruction. This was the first such experiment, at least in modern history. It was subsequently repeated by Hitler with the Jews, and again by Stalin with nationalities which were disloyal to him or suspected by him. This wave included only pathetically few of those kulaks for whom it was named, in order to draw the wool over people's eyes. In Russian, a kulak is a miserly, dishonest rural trader who grows rich not by his own labor, but through someone else's, through usury and operating as a middleman. In every locality, even before the revolution, such kulaks could be numbered on one's fingers, and the revolution totally destroyed their basis of activity. Subsequently, after 1917, by a transfer of meaning, the name kulak began to be applied, in official and propaganda literature, whence it moved into general usage, to all those who in any way hired workers, even if it was only when they were temporarily short of working hands in their own families. But we must keep in mind that after the revolution it was impossible to pay less than a fair wage for all such labor. The committees of the poor and the village Soviets looked after the interests of landless laborers. Just let somebody try to swindle a landless laborer. To this very day, in fact, the hiring of labor at a fair wage is permitted in the Soviet Union. But the inflation of this scathing term kulak proceeded relentlessly, and by 1930 all strong peasants in general were being so called, all peasants strong in management, strong in work, or even strong merely in convictions. The term kulak was used to smash the strength of the peasantry. Let us remember, let us open our eyes. Only a dozen years had passed since the great decree on the land, that very decree without which the peasants would have refused to follow the Bolsheviks, and without which the October Revolution would have failed. The land was allocated in accordance with the number of mouths per family, equally. It had been only 9 years since the men of the peasantry had returned from the Red Army and rushed onto the land they had wrested for themselves. Then, suddenly, there were kulaks, and there were poor peasants. How could that be? Sometimes it was the result of differences in initial stock and equipment. Sometimes it may have resulted from luck in the mixture of the family. But wasn't it most often a matter of hard work and persistence? And now these peasants whose bread grain had fed Russia in 1928 were hastily uprooted by local good-for-nothings and city people sent in from outside. Like raging beasts, abandoning every concept of humanity, abandoning all humane principles which had evolved through the millennia, They began to round up the very best farmers and their families, and to drive them, stripped of their possessions, naked into the northern wastes, into the tundra and the taiga. Such a mass movement could not help but develop subsequent ramifications. It became necessary to rid the villages also of those peasants who had merely manifested an aversion to joining the collective farms, or an absence of inclination for the collective life which they had never seen with their own eyes, about which they knew nothing, and which they suspected, we know now how well-founded their suspicions were, would mean a life of forced labour and famine under the leadership of loafers. Then it was also necessary to get rid of those peasants, some of them not at all prosperous, who, because of their daring, their physical strength, their determination, their outspokenness at meetings, and their love of justice, were favourites with their fellow villagers, and by virtue of their independence were therefore dangerous to the leadership of the collective farm. This kind of peasant and his fate were portrayed immortally in the character of Stepan Trautsov in S. Zalikin's novel. Beyond this, in every village there were people who in one way or another had personally gotten in the way of the local activists. This was the perfect time to settle accounts with them of jealousy, envy, insult. A new word was needed for all these new victims as a class, and it was born. By this time it had no social or economic content whatsoever, but had a marvellous sound, podkulachnik, a person aiding the kulaks. In other words, I consider you an accomplice of the enemy, and that finishes you. The most tattered, landless labourer in the countryside could quite easily be labelled a podkulachnik. I remember very well that in our youth this term seemed quite logical. There was nothing in the least unclear about it. And so it was that these two terms embraced everything that constituted the essence of the village, its energy, its keenness of wit, its love of hard work, its resistance, and its conscience. They were torn up by the roots, and collectivization was accomplished. But new waves rolled from the collectivized villages. One of them was a wave of agricultural wreckers. Everywhere they began to discover wrecker agronomists, who up until that year had worked honestly all their lives, but who now purposely sowed weeds in Russian fields, on the instructions, of course, of the Moscow Institute, which had now been totally exposed. Indeed, there were those same 200,000 unarrested members of the Working Peasants' Party, the TKP. Certain agronomists failed to put into effect the profound instructions of Lysenko, and in one such wave in 1931, Lork, the so-called king of the potato, was sent to Kazakhstan. Others carried out the Lysenko directives too precisely, and thus exposed their absurdity. In 1934, Pskov agronomists sowed flax on the snow, exactly as Lysenko had ordered. The seeds swelled up, grew mouldy, and died. The big fields lay empty for a year. Lysenko could not say that the snow was a kulak, or that he himself was an ass. He accused the agronomists of being kulaks and of distorting his technology, and the agronomists went off to Siberia. Beyond all this, in almost every machine and tractor station, wrecking and the repairing of tractors was discovered, and that is how the failures of the first collective farm years were explained. There was a wave for harvest losses in comparison with the arbitrary harvest figures announced the preceding spring by the Commission for Determination of the Harvest. There was a wave for failure to fulfill obligations undertaken for delivery to the state of bread grains. The district party committee had undertaken the obligation, and the collective farm had not fulfilled it. Go to prison. There was a wave for snipping ears, the night-time snipping of individual ears of grain in the field, a totally new type of agricultural activity, a new type of harvesting. The wave of those caught doing this was not small. It included many tens of thousands of peasants, many of them not even adults, but boys, girls, and small children whose elders had sent them out at night to snip, because they had no hope of receiving anything from the collective farm for their daytime labour. For this bitter and not very productive occupation, an extreme of poverty to which the peasants had not been driven even in serfdom, the courts handed out a full measure, 10 years, for what ranked as an especially dangerous theft of socialist property under the notorious law of August 7, 1932, which in prisoners' lingo was known simply as the Law of 7/8. This Law of 7/8 produced another big separate wave from the construction projects of the first and second 5-year plans, from transport, trade, and industry. Big thefts were turned over to the NKVD. This wave must further be kept in mind as one that kept on flowing steadily for the next 15 years, until 1947, especially during the war years. Then, in 1947, the original law was expanded and made more harsh. Now, at last, we can catch our breath. Now, at last, all the mass waves are coming to an end. Comrade Molotov said on May the 17th, 1933, "We do not see our task as being mass repressions." Phew, at last. Begone nighttime fears. But what's that dog howling out there? Go get 'em. Go get 'em.
So, there's more I could play from that, obviously. The reason the Russians starved was because they took out the best farmers. And so, here's the thing that I hope some of you who are listening, who are like, what's the whole deal with everybody calling people Marxists and this sort of thing, might get. When you understand the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn, when you understand what happened in communist Russia, when you understand these atrocities, when we catch a whiff of any of this, it freaks us out. It freaks us out. When Matt Chandler said that I would take a black man who is a 7 over a white man who is an 8, I physically got sick. Because this is exactly what I thought about. This is us taking out our best because of an ideology. That's what's going on here. And my question is, instead of engaging in that kind of tokenism, as Dr. Bauckham rightly points out in this lecture, instead of engaging in that, why don't we work to lift that black person up to an 8 or a 9 or a 10? They're capable of it. They've survived all kinds of atrocities. Look at the Jews. Look at the atrocities the Jews have suffered since time immemorial. And by all standards, they have the highest IQs of anybody on the planet. And that's not just due to luck. That's due to upbringing. And I could go into all that. But why not focus on those things instead of taking out our best in the name of an ideology? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about subverting the cultural hegemony. We're talking about taking out, and you notice there that the best farmers were taken off and put into train cars and headed to Siberia because they owned land. And those who were still farming the land, if they were caught taking ears of grain from the fields at night, because all that grain was supposed to go to the cities and then be distributed to everybody equally. It wasn't allowed for you to take some of the grain for yourself. But lo and behold, don't you know that when all that grain went out to the cities, it never reached back to the countryside, and these people were starving. And these women and children and men who were going out at night and clipping off ears of grain were equally carted off to Siberian gulags. Now, a Siberian gulag is like your coldest night with no food for a week, you shoveling snow all week. That was the gulag. This is why Marxism is dangerous. And that's why, if some might think that we overreact to this is what we're thinking about. When you mention, hey, I'll take a 7 instead of an 8. I'll go ahead and sacrifice off. I'll put that guy that's an 8 who has skills that are superior to this person in favor of my ideology. I'll go ahead and put that guy on unemployment so I can maintain my ideology. That's how it starts. And I think cultural Marxism, as Dr. Bauckham is talking about, is something that's more of a gradual process, perhaps, but it's the same kind of process nonetheless. And we think we might not ever do that. And I gave you the example of Matt Chandler choosing the 7 over the 8. But what about Eric Weinstein? Beloved teacher at Evergreen State, run off campus because he didn't think that he didn't hold to the ideology. They just lost one of their best professors in the name of ideology. Same thing with Erica Christakis and her husband at Yale because they didn't agree on the whole Halloween costume ideology. Run your best people off because of your ideology. Run them off at best. And if need be, maybe in the future, we haven't seen it yet, and I pray that we don't, we might have to put them in gulags, in prison. You think you're not a kulak. It's easier to be a kulak than you think. If you're white, heterosexual men, you're part of the hegemony. And we've got to overturn that. That's been the problem. Here's the thing, and what I mentioned at the outset. Yes, white, male, Christian, heterosexual, mate for life, have children, men, landowning, have done great evils in this world. There is not a form of slavery that I know of, and I'm somewhat of an historian. My background's in ancient Christian literature, but that kind of gives you an idea of history. Even in ancient Rome, the conditions weren't as harsh for slaves as some of the conditions in North America for slaves. It was horrifying. Chattel slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries was probably the most brutal form of slavery ever in human history. However, who led us out of that slavery? Was there a big slave rebellion that ended all of that and that they defeat? No. It was white, Christian, heterosexual, landowning, mate for life, children having men who decided this is wrong and we're not going to do this anymore. So the homogeny ended slavery. Think about that. This homogeny that is trying to be overthrown by cultural Marxism ended slavery. Did they try to perpetuate slavery? Part of them did. But the ultimate homogeny, now I'm mixing terms here, but really ultimately the homogeny that we're talking about ended slavery, because if you're going to be a homogeny, by definition, you have to rule and reign and set the tone for the culture. What happened? Did slavery persist? No, it didn't. It ended. So the homogeny ended slavery. Now you want to overthrow that. Those in that class, the white, male, heterosexual, they kept women from voting for a long time and oppressed them for centuries. From the rights and privileges held by that type of homogeny. But then what happened? Something happened. The homogeny transformed. They changed. Because who gave women the right to vote? It wasn't women. They didn't get it. They didn't gather up a bunch of guns and go up to Washington and hold the senators captive and say, give us rights to vote. They didn't do that. The men who were in charge, the men, the white, male, Christian, etc. That's who gave women the right to vote. Who invented tampons? A white man. I don't know if he was Christian or not. When we start treating people, white, male, Christian, heterosexual, as kulaks, you're going to start to eliminate the best people from your culture. And you're going to end up culturally starved in a lot of ways. The Soviet Union killed some of its best producers. Some of those people needed to be eliminated because they were exploiting people. But the overwhelming majority, as Solzhenitsyn explained, the ones that were bad could be counted on one hand. It's kind of like white supremacy in the United States. You can kind of count them on one hand. I mean, will we culturally kill our men? Make them irrelevant just because they've made, they have a certain plumbing, or they don't have the right melanin count? And that's really the basis of the problem. Okay, got to move on here.
I am a white woman. I am standing beside a black woman. We are facing a group of white people seated in front of us. We are in their workplace and have been hired by their employer to lead them in a dialogue about race. The room is filled with tension and charged with hostility. I have just presented a definition of racism that includes the acknowledgement that whites hold social and institutional power over people of color. A white man is pounding his fist on the table. As he pounds, he yells, "A white person can't get a job anymore." I look around the room and see 40 employees 38 of whom are white. Why is this white man so angry? Why is he being so careless about the impact of his anger? Why doesn't he notice the effect this outburst is having on the few people of color in the room? Why are all the other white people either sitting in silent agreement with him or tuning out? I have, after all, only articulated a definition of racism. White people in North America live in a society that is deeply separate and unequal by race, and white people are the beneficiaries of that separation and inequality. As a result, we are insulated from racial stress, at the same time that we come to feel entitled to and deserving of our advantage. Given how seldom we experience racial discomfort in a society we dominate, we haven't had to build our racial stamina. Socialized into a deeply internalized sense of superiority that we either are unaware of or can never admit to ourselves, we become highly fragile in conversations about race. We consider a challenge to our racial worldviews as a challenge to our very identities as good moral people. Thus, we perceive any attempt to connect us to the system of racism as an unsettling and unfair moral offense. The smallest amount of racial stress is intolerable. The mere suggestion that being white has meaning often triggers a range of defensive responses. These include emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and withdrawal from the stress-inducing situation. These responses work to reinstate white equilibrium as they repel the challenge, return our racial comfort, and maintain our dominance within the racial hierarchy. I conceptualize this process as white fragility. Though white fragility is triggered by discomfort and anxiety, it is born of superiority and entitlement. White fragility is not weakness per se. In fact, it is a powerful means of white racial control and the protection of white advantage. Summarizing the familiar patterns of white people's responses to racial discomfort as white fragility has resonated for many people. The sensibility is so familiar because, whereas our personal narratives vary, we are all swimming in the same racial water. For me, the recognition has come through my work. I have a rare job. On a daily basis, I lead primarily white audiences in discussions of race, something many of us avoid at all costs. In the early days of my work, as what was then termed a diversity trainer, I was taken aback by how angry and defensive so many white people became at the suggestion that they were connected to racism in any way. The very idea that they would be required to attend a workshop on racism outraged them. They entered the room angry, and made that feeling clear to us throughout the day as they slammed their notebooks down on the table, refused to participate in exercises, and argued against any and all points.
John 3:14 through 16. What we know that we have passed, we know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brothers. Whoever does not love abides in death. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. So, we're talking about white fragility here and why people react hostilely when they are accused of racism. It could be because they're racists. Could be, very well be. There are a number of people out there that are racist, that don't like people because of this color of their skin. And they feel bad about that, and when they're called out for it, they try to self-justify. But the thing of it is, when you call somebody a racist, you're calling that person, I mean, the author here kind of glanced over the moral, we're calling them immoral. You are calling somebody immoral in the most base sense of the word. Because if you hate somebody because of their skin color, you are, according to St. John here, and according to Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, you are hating that person. And I don't like being called a murderer without evidence. White people have been freed from racial stress. Maybe that's true. So what I'm getting from this author here is it's about time some white people experience some racial stress, because that's what's been going on with black people since forever. This is good. This subverts when white people are afraid they can't get a job, when they're afraid they can't get into a certain college, when they're afraid of this, that, and the other thing based on the race. It's about time white people felt a little bit of that. That's Malcolm X and Eldridge Cleaver, Black Panther thesis. You oppressed us, it's our turn to oppress you. And if that, I mean, that maybe just how it has to be. I hope not. But that's what's being suggested here. They say that white people need to experience a little bit of racial stress. And to be called racist when you're not, even if you are, even if you're not, it doesn't really matter. But this is why I like Dr. Baucham's lecture so much, because he is hitting on this exact point. White fragility is equated to questioning or debating this race narrative. So if I were to question what she had to say in one of these seminars, then that's my white fragility speaking. That shuts down debate, doesn't it? Oh, that's just your white fragility. You're just a fragile white person who's never experienced any racial stress in your life. And you're questioning me calling you essentially a murderer. You have questions about that? You're fragile. I mean, if you deny or take offense to being accused of murder, having inherent murder in your heart, then you're fragile. This shuts down debate. That's really amazing. I felt that when I first read this book. I was like, ooh, well, I can't say anything. I can't react. I can't slam my fist on the table. I can't slam my books down. See, what the author of this book doesn't get is that what she's accusing these people of is a basely immoral thing. And so to be brought in for sensitivity training is not white fragility. It's somebody who's being falsely accused. And it's no wonder they're angry. I would be. Don't bring me in for if my company brought me in for sensitivity training, I'd be mad. I'd be angry. I'm not a racist. I can say that all day long. But here's the thing, is they don't care about that. What is this all doing? It's subverting. It's shutting down the conversation. Oh, that's just your white fragility. You're just trying to protect your privilege. You're trying to protect your power. We get it. We understand. We're going to try to help you with that. See, shutting down debate, subverting. And that's the idea. Toward the end of helping black people? No, absolutely not. That's my biggest beef with all of this. This whole debate with the Southern Baptists, Reformed Baptists, all this stuff going on. Doesn't seem like anybody is talking about why at a 70% rate nationally are black women raising children by themselves, and in inner cities at a rate of 90%. These numbers are staggering. Unfathomable. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about the sheer disgust of black children being shot by each other in Chicago. That's not being talked about. We're talking about this stuff. Why? Not because we care about any of that stuff going on there. We don't care about a white or a black mother raising her children on her own. We don't care about that. We don't care about these children shooting each other in Chicago. What we care about is subversion. That's the point. And we'll take a 7 over an 8. And we'll continue to slowly but surely subvert until we are in a position where we can maybe use force to take the rest of those who will not submit, so we can upturn this evil hegemony that it's brought us freedom from slavery, the best country that has ever been imagined in human history, the most prosperity throughout the world. That's the hegemony we need to overthrow. Anyway, starting a little sermon here. Let me end with this. Folks who would resonate with what I'm saying, take heed lest you fall. We do sin even without thinking about it. We do have an implicit bias, don't we? And we act, I'm out there, I'm out and about all over this country, and I look at people and I look at their skin color and I make judgments about them. It's a funny thing. I was, the guy that taught me how to drive trucks was black. And ever since then, I think, I've always looked at because he's just this amazing truck driver. I've always looked at black guys as like way superior truck drivers to me. And most of the time they are. Anyway, that's my implicit bias playing out. Judging people by their skin color. We do this. We do this. But what's the solution? See, that's what I found so many times in these debates is we agree on there's a problem. Okay? We don't want teenage girls to get pregnant. We want them to wait till they get married and they have a family and this sort of thing. This always generally, statistically always works out for the best. If a girl finds a nice guy, they get married and have children, that always works out fairly well for the most part. In comparison to a teenager getting pregnant at 15, you compare the two, the situations, generally speaking, work out better when the girl waits, gets married, and have kids then. All the data demonstrate this. We agree that teenage pregnancy is a problem. Now, we're not talking about the child being a problem. That's not what I'm saying. The child is not the problem. The problem is the poor decision, right? That the teenage child chose to have sex and therefore they became pregnant. So we agree on that issue. Same thing here. We agree that men are sinful, that we look at each other with hate in our heart, and we need that corrected. But what's the solution? That's really the question. What's the solution? Is the solution to be browbeaten or exiled like Eric Weinstein at all into oblivion? Is that the solution? To just be shaved down to the core where you're just going to submit to this agenda? I don't think so. I think what we need is the forgiveness of sins. The solution to sin is not preach the law louder and with more force. The solution to sin is the gospel. Always is. We need the gospel in these situations from everybody. We need the forgiveness of sins because the gospel is what emboldens us, empowers us to fulfill the law. It's not more law preaching. We don't need bigger and louder, do more, try harder law preaching. We do need to fulfill the law, that's for sure. But where do we get the power to fulfill the law? It's from the gospel. And that's the mistake the cultural Marxists are making. I think Dr. Bauckham does a good job of pointing that out. Okay, got to quit for this week. Thank you to everyone listening on KNNA The Cross in Nebraska. Thank you to Steve Kozar at themessedupchurch.com. Donate to the Well Project, you tightwads. Just do it. Just bring yourself to do it. Donate to our Well Project. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.